please.
Right, my name's Robert Henderson. I'd like to come back to the Norwegian option, so-called. I'm completely against this because, as you probably noticed during the film, no mention was made about the terrible problem that the Norwegians have with immigration, and nothing was mentioned about the fact that they are signed up to the 4 freedoms of the EU. That's freedom of movement of trade, financial services, and most importantly, free movement of labour. And unless you believe that our own quizzling politicians will turn round if they renegotiate and say, we won't accept the 4 freedoms, you're just going to put us back into a noose from which we cannot escape.
Question, please.
Right, well, the question is precisely this. Why would we ever believe that the politicians who are likely to negotiate, should there be a vote to leave, can we honestly believe they would do anything other than tie us firmly back in?
Thank you. I'll let Peter come in first, as he was first on this.
Yeah, thank you for that. Dubious pleasure. Yes, I hear what you say. I understand your question, I think, being that you're against the Norway option because it involves being a member of the European Economic Area, the single market, and our immigration problem doesn't go away under that arrangement. Is that, I think, what you're saying?
That's fine.
Yeah, no, I think I understand what you're saying. I'm just clarifying that. Yeah, you've got a point, actually. What we are advocating with the Norway option is that we leave the EU, we retain membership of the EEA through EFTA. That is an option which we believe the British people would understand and accept. Leaving the EU overnight is something that is not possible to do. It is not that simple. It is considered desirable by many, but it's quite a complex arrangement. We've been in the EU now for, 4 or 5 decades. It's a complex subject. We are advocating the Norway option as a way out. It may well only be a stopgap. It may be a halfway house arrangement, perhaps. But it is a doable option which is achievable within the next few years and something that I think most people, the public, would understand.
Thank you. Number 2.
Ready?
Yes.
Hazel Prowse, a runner-up in the Brexit essay competition, and I estimated 2 years to leave. And this revolting peasant, who went to the same school as Lord Tebbit, suggests that we start by recovering what every sovereign state has, authority over its own taxation. Now, bad taxes on bread, salt and tea leads to revolutions. We now have taxes on all sorts of things, from domestic fuel down to toilet rolls. I suggest getting rid of VAT is a good way to start.
Well, you'd have a big hole in the finances if you got rid of VAT completely. The problem is that if you're going to have a fair amount of services, you've got to find taxes somewhere to pay for it. And the real problem is that the big money raisers are VAT and income tax. And if you abolish VAT, you're going to have to either have a big cut in services, or you're going to have to find some other form of taxation to make up for it. So although all taxes are always unpopular, nobody likes them, I'm not sure that really getting rid of VAT would be my #1 priority, to be honest with you.
Well, actually, the medium level of taxation pressure nowadays, it's about 55%. But with extreme cases that rises until 80%. So we have people, we have companies that works for more than half a year to pay taxes. But why is this so high? Why taxes are so high? We have to do what the European community asked us. That's why we have to collect taxes, and we also are not free to decide where to invest taxes. They go in the deep throat of the EC. No opportunity to decide how to spend, how to invest. Is it for education? Is it for industry? Is it maybe for artisans, for primary field, for secondary field? Not at all. We have to obey to the European community. It's not possible. It's a crime. I remember the slogan, but I believe it's deeply true. No taxation without representation. Nowadays, the European institution, the European community, is a dictatorship, no representation at all. We do not decide who to elect, how to vote, to decide and to build this dictatorship. Not at all. So, no taxation without representation. We must decide to refuse, and of course it's a political decision. We have to refuse to pay taxes to sustain, to pay our torturers, our dictators.
I mean, I find it outrageous that someone can be earning just over £42,000 a year and can be dragged into the upper tax brackets. And £42,000 a year in the southeast of England is not an exorbitant salary. But one of the reasons we have these huge crippling tax rates and 20% on VAT is because government is too big and bureaucracy is too big and the welfare state is far too big. And the welfare state in totality spends now over £220 billion a year. And of course another 14, John said, you know, there'll be a hole in the finances, but if we didn't spend £14 billion a year on Brussels, so we would be able to reduce our taxes. A lot of people would say if we money on international aid, most of it, an awful lot of it is wasted or goes to propping up campaigners abroad rather than to helping poor people abroad. There was that great line from P.J. O'Rourke that international aid is poor people in rich country giving money to rich people in poor countries. And we spend £10 billion on that a year. And we're, even on the basic level of immigration, I mentioned the welfare state. One of the reasons we have such high spending is precisely because we've lost control of our borders. We're always told, and one of my myths that I object to so much is that immigrants are huge, mass immigration. Of course, we want some skilled immigration, but mass immigration running at the levels we've seen in recent years at over 500,000 new arrivals a year is a wonderful boon to the British economy. They're all contributing hugely to our prosperity. In fact, if you come to this country, you would have to be earning over £28,000 a year to be a net contributor to the Treasury because of the mix of welfare, tax credits, and tax rates. And there's very few immigrants actually earning that sort of level, £28,000 a year, so they have to be subsidised through measures like child tax credits, working tax credits, child benefit, social housing, and that is one of the reasons why the welfare state is now so expensive. So the benefits of mass immigration, to me, have been grossly exaggerated and impose a higher tax burden on most of us.
Thank you. Can I now refer to Dr. Peter? Is there such a thing as a just tax, and is VAT a just tax?
I'm not a tax expert, but I do certainly think that we are living in a rather strange economy when more than 40% of the gross national product is spent on the public sector, whereas in China, which is reckoned to be communist, it was only 17%. And where in the Soviet Union, even under Stalin, it was only just over 50%.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your talks and explanations of the problems and some of the solutions. There's a question for the CIB, and maybe some of the other speakers have a point, and it refers also to what John was saying about the opinion polls and what they show. My understanding of the opinion polls is that about 30% want out, 30% want in, and 40% want something simpler. This is why I've been promoting the Norway option as a stepping stone. It is purely a stepping stone, a tactical way to say, what is the reality? We want to win a referendum. We want to win a referendum big. So my suggestion is Norway is a stepping stone, the EFTA single market, and then another one, a referendum on the Swiss option, another one on just becoming a normal country. Question is, would the CIB be interested in offering its members, setting an example and a referendum of their own members, Do they believe a stepping stone approach makes more sense, or an in-out approach makes more sense? And would that also be a good idea to set an example to other organizations around the country? And let's have referendums, start them ourselves.
I'll let Peter briefly come in on this one.
Right, again, thank you. Yes, is the short answer to your very succinct question. I would like to see the CIB organise a referendum, which I think is what you're saying, fairly swiftly, i.e. next year. We desperately need a referendum in this country on the very succinct question, do we stay in or do we leave the EU? What is going to happen in practice, I fear, is that if the Conservatives get back into office next year, they will fudge the issue with their nonsense about renegotiating, which if there's anybody in this room believes that we can genuinely renegotiate our entry into the EU, then I'd like to have a long chat with you. So clearly, the Conservative Party will fudge it. The Lib Dems don't want to know anything about it, and the Labour Party, goodness only knows, they'll clearly make the matter worse. So yes, the CIB should organise a very clear referendum, in or out. It will be a wonderful thing for the CIB to do. It will be put their mark on the issue. Nobody else is doing it, so yes, please do it.
Mr. Secretary, will you make a note of that for the agenda? Pass it to the National Committee and then get on with the work.
I'm a bit deaf, and I might have missed someone covering my question, in which case I'm sorry, but I can't help being deaf. Have you covered, and will you cover, please, what is the Campaign for an Independent Britain's relationship with UKIP, please, and do you advise voting UKIP, please?
Can I just deal with that from the chair for you on that one without passing it on? CIB is a non-party organisation, and people of any party and of none can become actively involved, providing that the persons signing up support the objectives, which is to get out of the European Union. Can I move on?
But I'm in my mid-30s, and a lot of my friends in their mid-30s, even people in 40s and 20s, young people, British people, many are unemployed now, and they're struggling to find, full-time work at best, let alone part-time work. So, if I've got friends who have worked in companies, and because of equal opportunities or whatever, they've got like Polish managers in, and individually they've all been fired for ridiculous things, one thing or another, or maybe in a case, one of a friend who was a delivery driver, she got rid of him, and he's somebody who worked with him doing the deliveries for a charity shop.
Can you wind it up to a question, please?
Okay, okay.
You're losing me.
Yeah, this is what I'm trying to say. You're talking very aggressively about cutting benefits, but if Polish managers are allowed to fire people and then start phoning Hungary and Poland and start inviting their friends over to work, which they seem to be able to do quite freely, and this is happening, then, what are we going to do here? Because there's going to be more British people unemployed, and if, British people don't seem to be firing Polish people and then inviting their friends to take the positions because there'll be trouble for racism or something.
We'll do our best. Leo.
Well, I do think one of the problems with free movement is, and as that case I mentioned in my speech, Laszlo Andor wants to force the British government to give all migrants from the European Union the absolute right to claim all benefits the British citizens can claim in Britain, and that would make the welfare state completely unaffordable. So that's one of the reasons I'm very strongly opposed to free movement, and I think that the welfare state in Britain should be for British citizens. But I think there is no doubt that over the last 20, 30 years, the welfare state social security system had become completely unaffordable, and it actually was providing perverse incentives towards people to remain unemployed, to not take any responsibility for their families or for their own lives. And to be honest, I know this coalition government gets tremendous criticism all the time, but I think one of the best things they're doing is something even Mrs. Thatcher failed to do, was actually to introduce some reforms and some moral basis to welfare, and we are seeing some of the benefits from that in the tremendous decline in unemployment that has defied all economic predictions and experts, that unemployment has fallen so precipitously even during a recession, and that's partly because of the welfare reforms that the coalition has introduced.
But cutting expenditure is actually incredibly difficult. I mean, the Conservative government, the coalition government we've got in power at the moment, came in very much with a platform of cutting back the size of the state. But actually, they've done very little to do this. The proportion of GDP that goes through as public expenditure has fallen by about 2% since the peak period in 2009. It's about 49%. I think it's now about 47 or 46%. So it's only come down very marginally, and that's at a time when the economy's improved and the amount of taxation coming in has gone up and the amount of welfare expenditure to some extent has gone down. So I just say to you that once you've got expenditure, public expenditure running well into the 40%, which is what we have, if you've got an economy which isn't growing very fast, so you've got large levels of unemployment and high welfare expenditure as a result of all this, it's extremely difficult to get the proportion of GDP down. We'll have to see what happens over the next Parliament if the Conservatives get back, because what's happened so far, they say, is just the start. We're now going to have much bigger efforts being made to cut back the state. Personally, I think they'll be very lucky if they get away with this. What I suspect will happen if they really do try and cut back on expenditure is the economy will just sort of go down and GDP will fall, and you'll find that the proportion of the money going through the state just stays more or less the same. It's not an easy issue to resolve.
Leaving the EU is seen as a right-wing cause. It is not, and as Hugh Gateskill pointed out right at the very beginning, it's very much a cross-party issue. So I blame, to a very large extent, the media for categorising those of us that want to leave the EU as being some sort of right-wing fanatics. And a part of the reason that that happens is that the press, and I'm going to get some criticism from the gentleman on the very left, I'm sure, or not politically on the left, that the part of the problem is that the media are oversimplifying. Leaving the EU is a complex issue. It is a matter for the left and for the right, and I think it needs to be better addressed in the media. And if it was better addressed in the media, I think a lot of people on the left would actually pick up the cudgel of actually wanting to leave the EU. So perhaps you should be addressing that question to the media through your letters columns in the local press, perhaps.
Liam.
For 8 years at the Daily Express, I had the great pleasure and privilege of working with Patrick O'Flynn, who's the chief political commentator of the Daily Express, a very bright guy, and he's now, as some of you no doubt know, he's become the Director of Communications at UKIP, and he's had a very high profile over the last few weeks. And his big thrust was always that UKIP had to appeal more to the left and had to appeal to Labour voters in the North and the Midlands who might feel betrayed by the Labour Party. And that was Patrick's big drive. And you see some of the consequences of that in the recent by-elections, where UKIP has actually done very well in some safe Labour northern seats. There's one other point that I want to make, and I face a great personal dilemma about this, is the only way in the end we're going to get out of the European Union is through an expression of the will of the British people, or it might even be the English people if Scotland votes, depending on what happens in 2014. And that will can only be expressed through a referendum.
Yes.
And there's only one major party that is actually offering a referendum. And I know an awful lot of people feel betrayed by Cameron and feel the Conservatives have been far too wishy-washy on the whole issue. But the fact is that if you want a referendum in 2017 or after the next election, the Conservatives are the one major party that is offering that. And this is a tremendous dilemma for me, because I admire Nigel Farage, I admire UKIP, as I said, Patrick O'Flynn's a great mate and colleague of mine. But if we're going to get a referendum, it's one party's going to put it in its manifesto.
It's a conditional referendum. Come on.
Just one very quick point, and that is that there is quite a lot of polling evidence about where support for UKIP does come from. And the last sort of figures I saw showed that for every 13 Conservatives who defected to UKIP, there were 8 Labour voters going to UKIP. So that's the ratio at the moment. It's a bit more than, it's 13 to 8 on those figures, which does suggest that the split is bigger on the right than it is on the left.
Thank you, John. Noni, do you have this sort of problem with who to vote for in Italy?
Yeah, and it's very deep. In Italy, if you express your position, your opinion, against the EU or against the euro, you are a fascist. I'm not a fascist at all, obvious. But I must express my idea when I see my people, when I see my country, when I see my nation. I want to be proud to say my nation when I talk of Italy. When I see my nation suffering because of this European structure, I have to say that this European Union is a great mistake. It was a terrible mistake to join the euro. It was a terrible mistake to accept the construction of such an EU.
My name is Lucy Carrington. I fought against euro for nearly 20 years and provided arguments, counter-arguments, and they went to the very top. And this is how I contribute to the fact that euro just failed to invade this country. But on this occasion, I'd like to raise a different issue. I'm also a member of UKIP. My question is, don't you think that European Union bosses are much worse than Putin is? Because Putin gave referendum to people in Crimea and they voted yes. Most of them voted, and this is what they really wanted to achieve, to stay as a part of Russia.
I think the answer is the whole Ukraine issue is a very complicated one. I mean, whether it was really sensible for the EU to push out its boundaries as far as it has done to the east, I think is a very open question, and whether it overextended itself by identifying itself as closely as it did with the Ukrainian regime that took over from the Yanukovych one, which collapsed, and it provided the amount of support it did without really being able to do very much to implement the threats that they thought they might be able to bring to bear, is a very open question. So I think it's a real mess there. Do I think Putin was right in effectively annexing the Crimea? I think that was a very high-risk strategy on his part, which may well end in serious tears. So does everybody come out from all this covered in glory? No, I don't think anybody does. I think it's been a real mess.
To me, the whole Ukraine crisis just shows the arrogance, the imperialism, and the megalomania of the European Union. Why were they so obsessed with dragging Ukraine into their embrace? Again, it's this belief that they have to relentlessly expand their territory and their part. Why can't the European Union concentrate on what they actually said they would do at their foundation, is boost the economies of Europe? I mean, it just proves it's a political entity. And I thought that it's just the height of hypocrisy to have European Union leaders lecturing Russia about democracy when they have such utter contempt for democracy, and they would know every referendum they oppose. And to call the referendum on the Crimea a sham vote when they don't allow us to have a vote at all, it's absurd.
Thanks, Leo. Mania.
Well, before looking at Russia, I need to look at Italy about referendum, because in our constitutional chart, it's not possible to pose under referendum everything which is strictly connected with the ratification of international treaty. So people cannot decide about international treaty. That's obvious. It's non-democratic, but EU is undemocratic. I don't want to make a comparison. I don't want to fix the point. We cannot elect people who rules EU. They are decided inside an elite, nominated inside an elite, and they, and for example, in Italy, it's not possible to do what, for example, France or Netherlands do with the European constitution. Italian people cannot say no to a treaty. So we have to work hard in order to gain our democratic basis. That's why before I said that it's not possible to talk about the EU as a cradle of democracy, because it's the prison, it's the jail for democracy.
Thank you. Peter?
Yeah, a lot has been said. I'll be very brief.
30 seconds.
Absolutely. The discussion about the Ukrainian situation and the EU's involvement with Ukraine, regrettably, hasn't been fully exposed in the UK media. If you want information about it, go to the blogosphere and go into some detail there. But the British media's coverage on the subject has been woefully thin, which is a bad reflection on the depth of cover that we get on international issues in the British media these days. But yes, I agree with what most people have said. And as for a referendum, yeah, there's a lot of talk about referendum. I wish we could have a referendum in this country, but regrettably, I don't see it happening in the short term.
Number 4.
Yes, my question is, can taxation ever be used to create a compassionate society?
Well, just briefly, I think one of the great problems with modern Western politics, and this is true of Britain as elsewhere, is that compassion is now equated with levels of public spending. The more you spend, the more compassionate you are. That's completely false. There's nothing particularly compassionate about extremely high welfare spending that actually encourages people not to take up jobs and actually encourages deadbeat fathers not to take responsibility for their children.
Just one or two comments on this. I mean, one of the problems about taxation is it is possible to transfer income from about the top 5% of income earners to roughly the bottom 20%, but nearly all the rest is churn. What you've got is the same people paying the taxes who get the benefits. And one of the real problems about the welfare state is how to unravel that situation and to avoid having very high levels of taxation, which are in fact disincentives and cause all sorts of problems and are expensive to administer. So that is really the strongest argument for having a relatively small amount of public expenditure. But once you're up to where we are now, 45% or something, it's very, very hard to get it down because there are so many vested interests around all the people who are actually getting into receiving the money.
Thank you. And we'll now move on to the last round of first questions. I'm sorry, you've had a question before. So anybody not had a question?
It's a very brief question. We heard a few moments ago that the only major political party offering the chance of a referendum, a fair referendum, is the Tories. I'd like to ask the 4 British members of the panel, do you believe Cameron when he says he'll give you a fair, in-out referendum? Because I don't.
Well, I'll answer from the chair. The answer is I don't believe him either. Leo.
Well, I do think if he got in, he would try and bring back some powers from Europe, not unlike Harold Wilson did in 1974. And I think it would be a largely cosmetic exercise. And I don't think he would, because most other European leaders aren't interested in giving Britain back any more power. So I think that would be a cosmetic exercise. He would try and go to the British people and say, look, I've brought some powers back, and so I want you to vote yes in a referendum. But I do think we would be offered some sort of referendum if the Tories had a majority at the next election, and that's why I would welcome that, because that would be the first chance that we'd had, the first chance really in our modern history that we'd have a chance to say yes or no to our membership of the European Union. So I don't think it should be sniffed at even if he is campaigning for a yes vote.
Now, I must say, I'm inclined to agree that if the Conservatives did win the next election, they're so committed now to having an election, a referendum in 2017, it'd be very difficult to back off. What the results of that referendum would be, I think is a bit of an open question. I think if serious efforts were made to renegotiate our position in Europe and they got rebuffed, I think would have a very negative effect on public opinion on the EU in the UK and might well lead to a more likely negative, in other words, out result than would otherwise take place. I think a lot's going to depend on what Cameron does in the referendum campaign himself. I think if he tries to renegotiate, he's bound to come back, if he possibly can, and say that the renegotiation has been a big success, exactly what happened with Harold Wilson in 1975. And so whether he would then himself campaign for coming out rather than staying in, I think would have a lot of impact on the electoral results the referendum results as well. But I do agree that having a referendum in 2017 is better than having no referendum at all.
Thank you. Peter?
In answer to the question, there's a fair chance that there would be a fudged referendum on the ridiculous assumption that there can be renegotiation. Anybody of any proper understanding of how the EU works, which I'd like to think I have, knows that you cannot renegotiate, you cannot push the train backwards. It's impossible. If there is a referendum, supposedly because it's renegotiated, it will be a nonsense. And even if there is a referendum, and even if the vote is to get out, which is by no means certain, the chances are that the government would probably ignore it, as indeed the Irish government did a few years ago when they had their referendum.
Right. The gentleman there, and I'll allow our treasurer to have the last word after. So keep it brief if you can.
Yeah, I'm an American tech executive from the Silicon Valley, and I couldn't agree with you guys more. It's just really awesome to hear the moral aspect of it come in and all that. Question for you. Are you coming to America? Are you reaching out to anybody on stateside as to, I mean, we've got the same problems over there with federalism and an ever-expanding thing and just, you know, unmitigated immigration. I mean, it's all the same issues. We'd love to hear you guys in the American media. Are you coming?
Peter, on this.
Very brief, because I know there's a lot of people want to say something on this. Sir, to your question, will you bear in mind that when you go back to the States, will you tell your fellow countrymen that we've lost our independence? We, the United Kingdom, have less powers of self-determination than any one of your states in your United States, okay? It is us that need the help from you. Thank you.
What can we do to help?
John, you wanted to answer this question, the Treasurer, on this one.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen. There's a couple of things I want to raise about some of the discussions that we've had. The first one was about the request that CIB holds a referendum on joining EFTA. When this comes up in the National Committee meetings, my position on it is that what we are seeking to do is to get a no vote. Now, there are several different options. The gentleman over there with the red shirt just mentioned, you know, we're going in with America. We could go into EFTA. We could do the European Economic Area. We could set up a trade agreement with the Commonwealth countries. We could go entirely alone, and I'm sure there's lots of other options that we could do. The danger that we have as an independence movement is that our message is actually watered down, and our opponents can drive wedges between us because some want to do EFTA, some want to do America, and some want to do the EEA and so on. So I think our position should be, as an umbrella body, that we should be telling people that we want you to demonstrate the benefits of all of these things, but when a referendum comes, we will be voting for no, and after that, there will then be a further discussion on exactly which of these options we're going to take. And my position is if there is a movement in sovereignty, for example, the EEA giving you free movement of people, that would go to a further referendum because that is, you know, denial of sovereignty to the United Kingdom. The other thing I just want to make perfectly clear is that CIB is a cross-party organisation. We have had some discussions today about taxation and benefits policy. The policy of CIB is that these decisions should be taken by the UK Parliament. Some might say we want more benefits, some might say we would rather, you know, cut the welfare state and give more people the opportunity of working. That is not our issue. Our issue is that the UK government should decide it. So any observations that we've had from the panel, which are very interesting, and I don't subject to anything that anybody said, but they are their opinions and not CIB's opinions. Thank you.